Is Cowboys Commanders still a rivalry? Anthony, you were telling me that over the last couple of days on this show as I was out, Linnell was saying no. The youngest in charge has put himself in charge again and has made a declarative statement that lots of people disagree with, including you. What did he say, and how do you feel about it as the resident DC native on this show, as opposed to my silly transplant self, who once upon a time perhaps had a different perspective on this because he worked in the other city?
This guy Linnell yesterday, man, he was saying some crazy stuff. Basically, he said Sunday's game is just another game, and that rivalries like Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese are far, better than the Commanders, Cowboys. He also equated it to being like Groundhog's Day, just another day. He was definitely laying some punchlines yesterday, and I was just sitting over here just like, dude, you don't understand. Like, just because in our my 28 years of life, we haven't really had a real rivalry with Dallas, or they've more so dominated, doesn't, take away from the fact we, at a point in time, was dominating in like the 80s and early 90s and things of that nature. I don't think you can disregard that. So that's why I said maybe it's our turn, to go on like a 10, 15-year dominant spree, but I still respect it.
I think it's actually hilarious that he brought up Caitlin and Angel, because it actually gets to the core of what makes a rivalry great. There are some rivalries that should just happen because of geography. Washington-Dallas is by no means one of them. I'm actually reading my old professor, Dennis Denninger, wrote a book on the Super Bowl, and he had in it, there's a lot of history of the NFL, and we actually talked to Denninger about the book on the show if people want to check that out in the podcast archive or on YouTube or whatever. But in like the original, after post-merger alignment of NFL divisions, the Cowboys for some reason have always been in the NFC East. And like, if you think that the geography doesn't make sense now, man, you should have seen some of the original divisions they had when they merged the AFL and the NFL and got it all together, and they had to move teams around and, convince a couple of teams financially, to switch conferences. But Dallas, for some reason, has always been with New York and with Washington on the east side. And remember, the Arizona Cardinals used to be in the NFC East because, of course, that makes sense for all of our, for those of you that aren't great with maps. Arizona's very not east. And by the way, neither is Dallas. But to Linnell's point, and I love it because Linnell is the king of like having really good information and then drawing the wildest conclusions ever with it. But like, what makes the Caitlin Angel rivalry something? Like, Iowa LSU doesn't mean anything. Chicago, Indiana, that one, at least geographically, those two cities aren't that far apart, and there's maybe a little big brother, little brother, but it's because they played for really high stakes games and both teams had some success. And then because they were competing really hard, there was some, competition level animosity. I think those two respect each other for sure, but like the fans on either side have their things, and that opens up a whole can of worms specific to that rivalry. But, with Washington and Dallas, the rivalry started because these were two great teams, like Staubach and the Cowboys teams, and then, some of the Washington teams into the 80s. And, they kind of traded being the best in the NFC East, and the Giants then came along in the early 90s with Parcells, and on down the list of the history of this division. The Eagles obviously have their say, especially in the 2000s. They've probably been the most consistent team, although the Giants have a couple of Super Bowl rings in that time, so they probably want a word, even though they're at the bottom of things right now. Point is, like, the rivalry happens because there's really important games that are played. And some of the NFC Championship games between Washington and Dallas in the 80s and early 90s, like, those were the games. I mean, especially the early 90s, as Dallas is getting their 3 Super Bowls and Washington's coming up at the end of their tenure. Were Washington and Dallas the best two teams in football? They played in the same division? I think you could probably make an argument for some of that time. And so I think that, like, to Linnell's point, it's hard for a younger generation to care about stuff that happened before they were born unless they were, like you, Anthony, indoctrinated in it. You grew up being taught by your dad and other folks around you that were around in those days to be like, hey, we're fans of the burgundy and gold team, and we hate Dallas. And that just isn't everybody's thing. And I think a lot of younger fans now like care a lot more about players than they do the laundry, if you will. But I think at the core of sports is still that kind of irrational hatred. And that's what to me, the best of it is like we're all maybe a little bit in on the joke. And then there's some parts of the fan bases that aren't in on it. And I'm not saying it's actually a joke, just kind of in on it. I'll say not even a joke / the joke. And it's like, why do you hate them? Because I do. Because I despise them. There's no good reason. I just do. You know, for us, and I realize we're going to say this in doing a radio show on a station that carries Georgetown games, nevertheless, in Washington, D.C., but like, as Syracuse alums, we don't like Georgetown. Secretly, would I tell you it's a really great school? Sure, I'll give you that.
What time is it, Craig?
It's currently 4:54, and Georgetown still sucks.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah, that's how I feel. Is there any rationale behind it? Of course not. Other than that's where I went to school and that's what I was taught. It's part of the curriculum. And so, yeah, do I understand that these two teams have not been good at the same time in a long time? And that is going to absolutely crush the fervor of a rivalry. Yes. I also think this is a bit of a one-sided rivalry, having had the experience of working in Dallas for a couple years. And especially when I was there, Dallas was good. This is like the 2013, 2014 Cowboys with Romo and the beginning of Prescott, but the best O-line in the league. Their defense was pretty good. Dez Bryant's there. He's one of the best receivers in football. They have this stupid, Dez caught it game in Green Bay where he did actually catch it, even though I'm sure a lot of people listening disagree. But that's because you hate the Cowboys irrationally because you're Commanders fans, and that's okay. I endorse that. But the point being, like, the Cowboys just were like, yeah, whoever the other good team is, if it's Philly, then we hate Philly. That's our biggest rival. We're the biggest one. Our biggest rival is the one coming for our throne because we're the Cowboys and we are king. And now, as we'll get to and never read the comments a little over half hour from now, I think the rest of the NFC East is kind of looking at Washington and being like, oh, crap. Like I think they've got it figured out there. That terrible owner is gone. That their head coach is a real head coach. Jaden Daniels looks like a dude. Like, for Philly, who has kind of ascended to that role of king of the division, like, there's a couple comments that I got in this last week from Eagles fan, like, hey, we know we got y'all this time, but like, we also know you're coming. And so I am curious if the Cowboys just fall, like, the rivalry is going to continue to disintegrate because the Cowboys are going to become the punching bags for the next couple of years at the end of the Jerry Jones era. If somehow Jerry pulls another rabbit out of his hat and they become competitive and Washington and Dallas do battle a bunch of times over the next decade, then the rivalry, I think, will be as strong as ever.
No, I feel you then. I feel you, man. I mean, it was just, again, interesting. And that's also in parts of why I said the last couple of days was long, because Linnell was in here talking about, Dallas and the Commanders. But good. It's always a good conversation, I feel like.
But to be dismissive of it and pretend like, it's nothing. Like, it's not nothing. It's not nothing. Yeah. There's years and years of history that are behind it. Is it at its peak right now? No. But does that mean that it is nothing? No. And is it fun to beat up on your rival when they stink? Yeah. Yeah, it is. Like,
hell yeah.
Yeah. And so, then there's what Syracuse and Georgetown has become the last couple of years, where it's we both stink, and then we're fighting amongst ourselves, watching all of the people that used to be our peers laugh at us. But we don't need to talk about that right now.